Hello and welcome everyone to the Wilson Center, where we are congressionally chartered, scholarship-driven, and fiercely nonpartisan and independent. I'm Ambassador Mark Green, Center President and CEO. You know, in my career, I've been truly blessed to be able to stay purpose-driven in all that I do. In Congress, I was able to work on initiatives like PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Act. As ambassador, I saw these initiatives in action, lifting lives and building communities. As USAID Administrator, I had the opportunity to hopefully strengthen and broaden these programs. And now here at the Wilson Center, I want to analyze them and try to find lessons that we can take for today's daunting challenges. Which brings us to today and a rare treat, the chance to hear directly from some of those who were on hand as these important tools were developed. The Center plans a couple of other programs as well, one on global health and one on Plan Colombia and Latin America. But the book Handoff, to me, is most interesting for the lessons it shows that were developed as we took challenges on and lessons that are still applicable today. Today, I want to explore part of that research that I don't think gets enough attention, smart development, through a brief discussion with a great panel of experts. But to get things underway, it's my honor to introduce someone who I deeply admire, whose work has really, I think, shaped so much scholarship here in Washington, D.C. Steve Hadley is the editor of Handoff. Of course, he's best known as National Security Advisor in the second term of the George W. Bush administration. In that capacity, he was the President's White House Foreign Policy Advisor. He directed the National Security Council staff and ran the interagency national security policy process. These days, among his many other roles, Steve serves on the National Security Advisory Panel to the Director of Central Intelligence, the Department of Defense Policy Board, and the Board of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Steve, welcome back to the Wilson Center, and it's good to have you here.
Mark, thank you very much, and thanks for putting this program together. Let me start a little bit on the beginning of this book, which is the spring of 2008, when President Bush called in Josh Bolten, his chief of staff, and said, you know, whoever follows me into this office has a big challenge. We've got a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, we've got the terrorism threat, and that was before we headed into the worst financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression. And what the president told Josh was he wanted the upcoming transition to be the best transition in history. And in some sense, this wasn't hard. I was in part of the transition from President Ford to President Carter. And when Zbigniew Brzezinski came in as President Carter's national security advisor into the Oval Office and then into his quarters, he found there was no staff, because they'd all been fired, no documents because they'd all been taken to the Ford Library, and no memos or anything to tell him what the status of the issues were. We've come a long way since then, but I think the transition between President Bush and President Obama was probably one of the best in history. And I think the two presidents and Josh and his counterpart deserve a lot of credit for that. One of the elements of the national security transition was an effort to develop a set of memoranda that would explain to the incoming administration what they were facing on the issues of the day, whether it was war on terror, Iraq, Afghanistan, Russia, China, you name it. And they all had the same format. We described what we found, what our strategy was under the Bush administration, what we thought we'd accomplished, and what remained to be done, and what was liable to be problematic for the new administration as they came into office. There were 40 of these memoranda. And what we did about 3 or 4 years ago, I went down to Dallas and took a look at them. I thought they were pretty good in my recollection. And we decided to get them declassified, and President Bush took the lead. And this book, Handoff, is 30 of those now 39 declassified memorandum. And what we did was we took those memorandum, and then the people on the NSC staff who either wrote the memorandum or worked on the issue wrote a postscript to them. The memorandum are exactly as they were handed over to the Obama administration. But the postscript then takes the history from the Bush administration forward. What happened under the Obama administration? What happened under the Trump administration? What happened under the early Biden administration? And on the basis of that, the authors of the postscripts looked back, said, what does it tell us about how the Bush administration did? What did they get right? What did we get wrong? And then finally, looking back now 20 years over 4 administrations dealing with the issue, what are the lessons learned for future presidents? Because most of those issues that were confronted in the Bush administration are still with us today. So that's what the book is. Based these memorandum, postscripts, there is a foreword by President Bush, a preface by Condoleezza Rice and myself, which talks about a balance of power favoring freedom as the organizing principle for Bush foreign policy. And then 3 outside essays, one by Hal Brands, one by Mel Leffler, looking back at Bush administration foreign policy, and a final one by Martha Kumar that looks at the transition from President Bush to President Obama, which she calls really the gold standard of presidential transitions. Now, accompanying the book is an archive, being a digital archive, being maintained at the Presidential Leadership Center at SMU University. And the Center for Presidential History, as it is called, maintains this archive. And what the archive is the 30 transition memorandum in the book, the 9 others that are not in the book but have been declassified, and voluminous attachments that were attached to each of these transition memos, presidential speeches, policy documents, records of NSC meetings, meetings of the National Security Council, records of conversations the president had with his global counterparts. And if you take these together, that is to say the book and then the archive at the Presidential Center for Presidential History at SMU, you have really a repository of documents that tell the story of Bush administration foreign policy. Why is this useful? 2 things. I think the transition memos, and particularly Martha Kumar's essay, tell the story of what 2 presidents of different parties working together with their staffs can do in order to ensure that an incoming administration is fully prepared to discharge the responsibilities that they come to them when they enter into the office. That's an important lesson for the American people, and it's a lesson of how our institutions have matured and how we now are taking seriously presidential transitions. And the other thing I hope is that scholars, journalists, men and women in this country who are interested in foreign policy will be able to go to the book and go to the archive and learn something about what foreign policy was like at the Bush administration. There's a lot people do not know. There's a lot we knew and have forgotten and shouldn't have forgotten. And one of the things that either we did not know or pay enough attention to, and many people have forgotten, was exactly the subjects that Ambassador Green and the Wilson Center are putting together. That is to say, what the administration did for the Global South in general, and Africa in particular, with respect to a new approach to development, with resolving 6 terrible conflicts on the continent of Africa, and also establishing a national program that became an international initiative to deal with HIV/AIDS, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases that were killing tens of millions on the continent of Africa, and which saved tens of millions of lives. So I want to salute and thank you, Ambassador Green and the Wilson Center, for hosting this program and calling attention to these important issues. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. As I've mentioned, our plan is to hold a series of events. We want to focus on Africa and global health, as well as Latin America and Plan Colombia. But today, I'd like to focus generally on smart development, and we have just the right panel to do that. Josh Bolten was White House Chief of Staff in the second George W. Bush administration after serving as the Director of OMB and Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He's currently the CEO of the Business Roundtable. Gary Edson served as Deputy National Security Advisor and Deputy National Economic Advisor to President Bush. He co-led development of PEPFAR and conceived and established the Millennium Challenge Corporation to fight global poverty. He currently serves as president of the COVID Collaborative. Henrietta Fore served in the single most important post in all of government, Administrator of USAID. She was also Director of U.S. Foreign Assistance, Undersecretary of State for Management, and of course, most recently, she served as the Global Executive Director of UNICEF. Welcome to all of you. Josh, let me begin with you. I remember when Governor George W. Bush was campaigning for president, I don't remember him campaigning on these issues. How did this come to him? What caused him to embrace some of these challenges and thus develop some of the approaches that we're here to talk about?
Mark, first, thank you for the work you do and for hosting this session. Thanks to Steve Hadley for the extraordinary work, Steve, that you did in putting together this important volume titled Handoff, available on Amazon.com. It really is a terrific piece of work. Mark, you asked, was this part of the Bush 2000 presidential campaign? You're asking the right person because I was the policy director of that campaign, and I share your recollection of development assistance playing no part whatsoever in the president's campaign. He campaigned on education. George W. Bush had intended to be, as he was a governor, he intended to be the education president. He campaigned on economic vitality here at home. He campaigned on a muscular but restrained foreign policy. And he certainly never campaigned on dramatically expanding foreign assistance and changing the way we approached foreign assistance in this country, I think forevermore. What changed? Several things. The obvious one is 9/11, but I'll put that second because President Bush's interest in development assistance, in global health, predated 9/11. His interest really was piqued as he entered into the presidency. And in entering into the presidency, all of not just the country's problems, but the world's problems are on the president's desk. And at the time, this was one of the enormous problems the world was facing, especially with the AIDS pandemic that was threatening to destroy really a whole generation in Africa, just completely decimate isn't the right word because that means only 10%, and a lot more than 10% of Africa was afflicted with the AIDS pandemic. And I think there were several things that generated his interest in doing what he could as president of the United States to ameliorate that crisis. And I think we really have to go to his faith and his philosophy first, where he approached so many issues as president with a focus on the dignity of human life and that every life matters. And he brought that to so many different issues, but that the fact, as he learned from Steve Hadley and Condi Rice and from his then Secretary of State Colin Powell. The fact that literally millions of people were dying in Africa from a disease that here in this country, because we are wealthy, could be ameliorated, I think it literally made him angry. And he brought a righteous anger to his approach to this issue. The second part is 9/11 and the sea change in both the world order and his presidency that 9/11 brought about. As a result of 9/11 and the result of a literally on that day, the focus of the administration changed to prosecuting the war on terror and preventing the tragedy of 9/11 from never being repeated in this country, or hopefully in others as well. He focused on what are the causes of the sort of terrorism that leads to the disaffection and hatred that prompted those members of Al Qaeda to take down the trade towers. And he saw that if the national security of the United States is wrapped up in ensuring that the kind of animosity and despair and hopelessness that brought about 9/11, that to the extent the United States could ameliorate that, especially in the poorest places on the planet, that we would be enhancing our national security. And so those two things came together, and he became the president who proposed the largest expansion in global health assistance in the history of this country, or of the world, really, at the time. And the president who more than doubled foreign assistance. And he never said a word about that during the campaign. And
probably a good thing.
And probably a good thing. It would have cost him a lot at the time. It would have cost him a lot of votes in the Republican primary. Hopefully, with the success of PEPFAR, the AIDS program, PMI, the malaria initiative, and so on, that would no longer be the kiss of death in a Republican primary. But we shall see.
So, awakening a sense of right and wrong and morality, good notions, that's not enough, obviously. It's also about understanding what it takes to bend the arc and to make a difference. Gary, you were intimately involved with PEPFAR, but as you often point out, before PEPFAR, there was the Millennium Challenge Act, which brought about, in a number of ways, a different approach to development, lessons that were applied in many things that we do. So where did that come from? What led you to some of these notions from the Millennium Challenge Act, and how did that change, or how did that shape the approach the administration took?
Well, you're right. Millennium Challenge really laid the foundation for PEPFAR, and also laid the foundation for the president's effort to really transform the way in which development assistance was conceived, used, and delivered. And I think that there were two things that drove that effort. One, echoing what Josh said, was the president's belief that in a world where half the population is suffering from disease and poverty, that world is neither just nor stable. And so we had a moral and a national security imperative to act. And I think the other thing that drove that effort was a perception that aid wasn't working the way it should. Remember, this was 2001, 2002. Aid was based upon the old paradigm of donor-recipient, which was paternalistic, bred dependency, flew in the face of human dignity. And all of the talk about aid was about inputs. How much were we going to spend? Not about outcomes. What results were we seeking to achieve? And how could we do that most cost effectively? Now, interestingly enough, there started to emerge some research that showed that aid was more effective in good policy environments. So people started talking about something called selectivity. And at the time, I had the ignominious fate of being the G7 Sherpa. Actually, that year it became the G8. Amazing to believe that Putin was at that table. And at one Sherpa meeting, I argued that we should condition more aid on countries that were enacting sound policies to combat corruption, to promote the rule of law, to support economic opportunity. And the French Sherpa almost fell off his chair. He said, "Mon Dieu, what are we going to do about the Francophone countries?" And the British Sherpa said, "What about East Africa?" And the Italian said, "What about the Horn of Africa?" And it was clear that they felt straitjacketed. They felt politically constrained by their colonial baggage. But as President Bush famously pointed out to French President Jacques Chirac at that summit, that was their burden, not ours. And so we were free to develop an initiative that would select countries for greater assistance based upon a set of rigorous, publicly transparent criteria or indicators with a view toward promoting economic growth and putting them on the path of what you later called at USAID the path to self-reliance. So in March of 2002, in a speech before the Inter-American Development Bank with Bono behind him, President Bush announced the Millennium Challenge Corporation. And he called for, quote, a new compact for development between rich and poor nations based upon true partnership, country ownership, and shared accountability for results. And those were exactly the principles that many months later we built PEPFAR on. What the president was effectively saying was, we'll give more if you do more in 3 areas. The Millennium Challenge Corporation rewarded countries that governed justly, invested in the health and education of their people, and promoted economic freedom. And since then, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has partnered with some 50 countries across the world and benefited an estimated 250 million people. But what's really interesting about the story is that it had an outsized influence because of 2 things that happened after that speech. First, we embedded those very same principles in the landmark Monterey Consensus on Financing for Development, which through successive iterations has underlaid development policy globally for 20 years. Second, thanks to Steve Hadley and Condi Rice and the president, we embedded those principles in the 2002 National Security Strategy, which called for an ever-increasing circle of development. And that elevated global development as a key element of U.S. foreign policy and national security. And by my way of thinking, that was really the first formal expression of what came to be known as smart power, the integration of soft power and hard power in a coherent strategy, which in typical Bush fashion was both big-hearted and hard-headed. So that's how the Millennium Challenge Corporation came about, and I think that's the influence it had on development thinking.
Yeah. So, Henrietta, let me pick up with that. You were obviously at aid and involved in all of this, but also later on at UNICEF, how did the impacts of this new approach affect your work and the things that you would take on?
So, Mark, it's It's wonderful to be back in the building again. This is our USAID building, but it's also the Wilson Center, and your work is excellent, to Josh's point. And Steve, thank you for the book. It's remarkable. It's a really, really good book. So, so we saw both PEPFAR and the MCC on the ground. PEPFAR, what struck you first on the ground was that there were people. So PEPFAR was able to actually get funds out for doctors, nurses, healthcare assistants, so that there were people who were being trained and they were actually at work. The presence of people for HIV/AIDS was a game changer in Africa. And sometimes we forget that just staffing a little local village clinic makes a difference, but it does to the person who wants to come in or the family who wants to come in. The second thing that struck you was that there was a supply chain, and it was a smart supply chain. It was public-private. It meant that there were a variety of cocktails that were coming out. There were hygienic equipment and supplies and tools, but that was thought through, and it changed how you thought about health in Africa. The third thing that immediately struck you is that it clicked in Africa. Africa could feel that America cared, and America could feel that Africa cared. So it was something that worked. It connected with the people in the countries, and that is something that sometimes you don't get in development assistance, but when you get it, you know it, and PEPFAR did it. It also became, lastly, a platform that we learned from. So in the beginning, when you wanted to save lives, we didn't know everything about mother-to-child transmission of HIV/AIDS, and it was a serious issue for the next generations who would be born in Africa. But we came to understand it and to learn it, so we learned on the ground, and that was a very important part of PEPFAR. And then to MCC. MCC changed how we thought about development. USAID was very wary in the beginning for what MCC might do, but then it was clear that it was a colleague in development, and development needs all the colleagues it could get. And having President Bush and Condoleezza Rice and Steve Hadley and Josh Bolten and everyone involved in it, it made a difference when Gary then wanted to start the MCC. So the MCC brought something different to development. It brought measurements. It brought an attention to anti-corruption that we really had not had. It brought an attention to women in education. When I would go in to talk to a president or prime minister, they would know their statistics. So the data made a difference, and our values made a difference. So MCC changed how countries thought about us. So if we fast forward into today, and what we have taken from all of this is that measurements are now done as a due course. It's still very difficult, if you're a local NGO, to understand how to do all of the measurements. But to do them means that you can talk with a president, a prime minister, a minister, about how your sector is doing in the important areas that we've worked, Mark, like education and health and energy. And it means that a government becomes accountable. So there are many legacies that come out of it. Because I had the pleasure of reading this book, I might also mention that there are a few other things that come out in the book that I saw at this time period. One was, it was a time when we were thinking about terrorism, so anti-terrorism, the whole issues about how you would deal with countering violent extremists, how you would counter insurgencies came up. In the development community and in the diplomatic community, these were difficult issues. It is well worth studying, though, how many of these non-state actors interact with their cultures and their communities and how they get people to follow them, because it's often based on development and community connection. The second area that came up very clearly in the book is that of the freedom agenda. And the freedom agenda was very unsettling to many governments because they didn't know what to do with this messy democracy. And many of the young people who were getting involved in speaking out and marching, and it became difficult for them. And yet, The focus on institutions was very important, how to build good institutions, how you encourage a society. So it brought a new way of thinking that was very important to the development community, but it's very difficult. The third area that I think became clear is that President Bush and Condoleezza Rice were clear that people made a difference. We needed to get people on the ground. So there was a staffing up in both the Department of State and in AID, and that made an enormous difference. If there are people with eyes and ears on the ground, it means you can accomplish things on the ground. So that was a great legacy that they left, because it meant that then there were agencies that could take that work. And then as I was reading in the book, I was reminded when Georgia was brought up, that the Russian advance had been first to give passports to the Georgians and then bring the tanks in. It reminds you of today, so that whenever you're reading history, it brings up new lessons to learn, and it's an excellent book for teaching.
President Bush in his message talks about the importance of partnerships. And I think sometimes people forget that that also was an innovation. So there was a time when foreign assistance was a bucket of money given to a foreign government, then you sort of walk away and that's the end of the story. But the Bush administration understood that unless you work with partners on the ground, for-profit, not-for-profit, communities of faith, you could not reach corners that you needed to reach. Josh, you're now leading one of the more important organizations of major businesses. How does the role of business in the world change as a result of some of these tools and development? And are there ways in which the business community can partner, should partner, and can make a difference in poverty relief in particular?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. There are a lot of ways that the business community has contributed and can continue ever more to contribute. It was really it was a dramatic shift when President Bush pursued the MCC, the Mother-to-Child Transmission Initiative, PEPFAR, then a malaria program, and a neglected tropical disease program. All of them, by the way, under the aegis of the gentleman to my left, who deserves enormous credit here, along with the president. And one of the insights that the president brought to this was his own sort of innate Republican antipathy to government, doing things not very well, and his own determination that if he was going to lean in heavily and do what he never campaigned on, as you pointed out, Mark, that he wanted it done the right way, that he wanted the right results, and he knew that the right results would come from engaging the private sector, engaging the NGO community, especially the faith community, which in many respects has the best record in places all over Africa in ameliorating poverty. And it was his determination to make sure that all of those were intricately intertwined. And the gentleman to my left is the one who, along with at the time, relatively little-known NIH director named Tony Fauci, went off into a corner and concocted a plan that brought all of those elements together in a way that could garner bipartisan support and be sustainable over now 2 decades and probably many decades to come.
Gary, I want to switch gears on you a little bit. a few years ago, I was at a compact closing, a closeout, a finishing of a compact in a West African country, and the centerpiece of the compact was roads that were built. And I remember that when all was said and done, a young lady came in to see me, and she said, "I just want to thank you." She said, "It's not for the roads. We can build roads. Everybody knows how to build roads. MCC taught us how to do it transparently, on budget, on time, and now we have a large group of young Africans who can do that." Was that part of the thinking on MCC, that you would also be building the capacity and experience of a generation who would operate under these principles?
Yeah, I think that I've run some NGOs, and I remember in meeting with the board for the first time, and I said, success. I remember in the interviewing process, they always ask you, what's your definition of success? And I said, my answer was, success is when we no longer need to meet. When there is no need for this organization. The business of business is to stay in business. The business of a nonprofit is to put yourself out of business. Help other people solve that problem, and if you can't do that, get out of the way and let somebody else do it. And the idea behind MCC and PEPFAR too, if you look at the evolution of PEPFAR, is to increasingly empower the people we're serving to serve themselves and to then get out of the way. And so I think that the notion that, and I think you echoed this in your tenure at USAID when I mentioned the road to self-reliance, it's at the point you no longer need us that is victory. And then yet what remains is that partnership that endures. And I think that to not put too fine a point on it, these initiatives remind us of the role that smart power can play. PEPFAR with its investments in human capital, MCC with its investments in physical capital, roads, ports, power, USAID with its investments in both, encountering China's attempt to leverage the extractive Belt and Road Initiative for geopolitical gain. And I think that our model is a powerful one, and I'm glad to hear the story you related, because that means it's working.
In the time we have left, I'd like to have us think about how these lessons in smart power apply to today. We have a few things going on in the world right now. Henrietta, what do we take from some of these smart power tools as we continue to work on COVID? Increasingly in the rearview mirror, but far from over. What do we take from these smart power lessons?
Well, Mark, let's go to one area that you mentioned with Josh, which is businesses. Businesses and private sector are such a strength for the United States, and we still do not use it well enough. Both PEPFAR and the MCC are public-private partnerships. They can work with both the local community and they can work with the American community. And we haven't gotten all the functions right yet. It doesn't move quickly and easily, but we really need to. So I think one of the lessons is, for America, let's get public-private partnerships and the private sector to be able to move quickly with NGOs and with government whenever the need arises for humanitarian short-term work, but also for long-term development work. Another one is, to your point and the work that you're doing here at the Center on Migration and whether it's a a human or a man-made, whether it is a natural disaster, people flee when something happens to their home village. I think using artificial intelligence, we could anticipate much more. So we began using that with Ebola. We knew where families were located, and thus if you became sick, where in the Democratic Republic of Congo, let us say, you would flee with your family. That meant that then we needed to get those clinics to have the supplies that we can get to them there. But artificial intelligence can be a real asset to us, and I think that in anticipating, preventing, that will be very important. In natural disasters, just where we have water is an important indicator for where migration will start. So whether it's in the Northern Triangle in Central America, or whether it's in the Jordan River Valley or in Yemen, people will leave if there's a drought. They can no longer grow their crops. They can't really have their families living there. And so as a result, we could have anticipated that. We know where the river basins are low. You can do all of that now with technology. So anticipation, I think, will be very important in using public-private partnerships. There's another point that's made in this book, which is about strengthening allies. So strengthen your friends around the world, but don't forget that the countries that you aren't particularly friends with, you can make friends, and you never know when you're going to need them. I think Josh and Gary will both say that in their experiences after 9/11, we had to make friends with countries and entities that we hadn't known we needed to. And as a result, you need to think about how to build friendships and long-term friendships so that the world can be better and so that American power can be used better. The other thing that I think we often overlook now is that at this time it was really the beginning of thinking about how media and how you can thoughtfully engage hearts and minds was going to interact. You mentioned faith-based, very powerful. But I think we are in a period now where we need to really think about how in various cultures, hearts and minds are persuaded to go in one direction or another. There's too much violence in the world. I saw that at UNICEF. We need peace for children to grow up strong and healthy and educated. So we really have to think through how we use those tools and how we influence people around the world and how they can share our American values that both Gary and Josh have talked about how President Bush wanted to do. But we need to really think about that carefully.
Gary, I'm going to go to you if you have any additional thoughts from your experience in the Bush administration and now the work that you do on COVID, but also would like you to start on one of the other big topics of the day, and that's Ukraine and Ukraine reconstruction and what that might look like.
Let me answer both of those issues by saying that I think that there are two big lessons, takeaways that we can draw from these Bush-era reforms. And the first is that despite the fact that we live in this highly polarized environment, bipartisanship is not only vital but possible. I mean, we need to remember that PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation and all these initiatives were made possible by a really vibrant, bipartisan coalition of strange bedfellows, preachers and activists, rock stars and generals, CEOs and NGOs, all coming together. And what we need to do is we need to rebuild that coalition. And we need to strengthen it, and we need to bring new voices and new leaders in from both sides of the aisle to address everything from the reauthorization of PEPFAR to global pandemic security to support for Ukraine. And speaking of that, I think the other thing these reforms remind us of is who we are as a people, our ideals as a nation, and the role of U.S. leadership in confronting global threats. You know, we recently have heard some voices calling for new cuts in aid. And we hear voices on the right and on the left questioning our support for Ukraine, arguing that we have more pressing problems at home. And I'd argue that that's a zero-sum thinking, that it's framing development assistance and foreign assistance as an either-or choice between the child in Kyiv and the child in Kentucky, the child in Uganda and the child in Utah. That's a false dichotomy. The truth is that great nations don't choose between the child at home and the child abroad. They help both, which is what the United States has done from the Marshall Plan through PEPFAR and now in our engagement in Ukraine. So I think we need to remember what President Bush said when he announced the Millennium Challenge Corporation. He said that for moral and for national security reasons, we cannot leave half of humanity behind as we seek a better future for ourselves. There are no second-class citizens in the human race. And I think that that's a powerful message that we need to keep in mind as we think about the ongoing impact of these reforms that were undertaken.
Josh, is it still possible to build that bipartisan coalition when we take a look at Ukraine, for example? And assuming it is possible and we can mobilize resources for Ukraine, what should Ukraine reconstruction look like broadly, applying some of the smart power lessons from the Bush years?
Wow.
In 20 words or
Mark,
less.
Yeah, Mark, I won't answer the second part of that question because it beats me, but there are a lot of people a lot smarter than I who have some really good notions about how to apply all of the lessons that we've learned, especially since World War II, to the reconstruction of Ukraine, which will be critical. But let me take the first part of the question, which has to do with how do we maintain a consensus for the United States continuing to make that our mission, as Gary so eloquently described. And part of it is you've got to do your job really well. That is the role of the Wilson Center, so ably led. And in helping sustain a bipartisan consensus that was in part built in this century during the Bush administration, but was picked up, I thought, enormously effectively by the Obama administration. In parts, continued even through the Trump administration, which had a number of people, including yourself, dedicated to the maintenance of a bipartisan consensus for the role of the United States in the world. And one of the things that you and all of us need to remind our policymakers of is the effectiveness of even modest measures by the United States, from our standpoint, modest measures in promoting the well-being of the rest of the world and ensuring our own national security. Gary mentioned that foreign assistance will likely come under threat in the course of the next round of budget discussions. We were discussing before that when we took a poll and asked people, how much of the budget do you think goes to foreign assistance? The average American will tell you, oh, it's about 25%. Well, George W. Bush essentially doubled real foreign assistance and brought it close to 1% of federal spending. Not 1% of GDP, 1% of the entire federal budget. And we need to remind folks that those may be some of the most valuable dollars that are spent by the federal government. And they are valuable from a humanitarian perspective because a pill that costs 25 cents can save somebody's life in countries that otherwise can't afford that pill. And they're valuable from the standing of the United States in the world. And the lesson we need to make sure that our current policymakers remember is that the United States is better off with a world that is prosperous and at peace. And if the United States does not play its leadership role, we will lose all prospect of that.
Well answered, at least one of the two questions.
One of the two questions.
So for both Gary and Henrietta, those tools that we've been talking about as we look ahead to challenges like Ukraine, do they need to be adjusted? Gary, we've spoken briefly about when the Millennium Challenge Corporation was created, the income criteria, income restrictions, should that be revisited? And Henrietta, for you, as we talk about the importance of investments in global health, what do we need to do to make sure that we are capturing some of those poor families that are on the move? So to each of you, I'm giving you a chance to adjust some of these tools or make them robust or use your experience.
If I could go back in time. I think with respect to the Millennium Challenge Corporation, look, going to the budget point, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, you get double the bang for your development buck. You get change in the reform and change in the countries that have earned it, and you incentivize reform in the countries that want to qualify for it. You're right. The one thing a couple of things that the Millennium Challenge Corporation needs to do is it needs to expand the eligibility criteria now to the poorest countries, the top 125 poorest countries in the world, and that will expand the reach of the organization. The other thing that it now has,
Is that especially true in an era of great power competition?
and that is exactly what that's about, so that it can qualify for support in lower and middle income countries, which are really the battleground countries in so many ways, ideologically at least. The other thing is it now has the power to do regional compacts, and recently closed its first regional compact in Africa. So those are tools that it needs and can be leveraged. On the PEPFAR side, we've seen how PEPFAR, the platform, was used to combat COVID. Now, in the reauthorization, though, we need to be careful. It is the president's plan for emergency plan for AIDS relief, not the emergency plan for pandemic relief. And we need to make sure that as we build on what PEPFAR has done, and by the way, people talk about health system strengthening all the time. There is no single greater health system strengthening initiative ever launched than PEPFAR. We didn't intend it that way, but that was the consequence of it. And as we strengthen those health systems, they were better prepared to respond to pandemic threats. But we need to make sure that we don't cannibalize the funding for HIV as we think about expanding PEPFAR.
Henrietta, real quickly to you before I wrap up. We're short on time, I'm afraid.
So I try to open up America on the public-private partnerships. If we could do that, it is a great strength of
And
America.
connect every refugee camp and IDP camp in the world to the internet,
Absolutely.
as we have spoken many
Bring
times.
education to the world and to all the refugees that are running. If you can educate a child, you will have a friend for a lifetime and someone that you can build a better world with. So,
Great panel, great discussion. I've learned a lot, and I think it's a reminder, thanks to Steve Hadley and his good work with this book, that some of the lessons that we've learned, didn't get everything right, but some of the lessons that we've learned are as applicable today as they were back then. Lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. As Josh put it directly, this book is available on Amazon.com. But I also want to point out that this book is dedicated to, and I'm quoting, those who serve our country in its armed forces, diplomatic corps, development agencies, and intelligence services, which means that any and all royalties generated by the sales of these books will be donated to 3 public charities serving the needs of those communities and their families, very much in line with what President Bush would want to do. So another way that we can take compassion and put it into action. Thanks to everyone. I hope you'll join us for our coming events, Global Health in Africa and Latin America and Plan Colombia. Thanks very much.